Welcome to The Other 51. I'm Brian, and this week we're talking with Katie Cook, a comic book artist and the creator of Nothing Special. Katie Cook, welcome back to The Other 51. Thanks for coming back and joining us again.
Thanks for having me again.
Last time, we talked about Hamilton, we talked about My Little Pony, and now we have quarantine, so we have a lot of limited stuff. How is quarantine life treating you as a stay-at-home cartoonist?
Well, it just means everybody is in the house now, and I'm not used to that. I'm used to everybody being gone all day. So it's kind of like having coworkers for the first time in a decade.
So do you have, I mean, we're a couple months in as we record this now, but as people continue to work from home, as someone who's done this for a long time, any survival tips for people who are still getting used to working from home?
For me, mine has always been don't let yourself watch TV or play video games because then you're never going to get anything done. But then that's taking away like the small joys in life for people at this point. And I've completely flubbed on it because now it's like I got up early this morning to get to the Animal Crossing island before my kids destroyed it today.
Well, you got to see how much turnips are going for in the morning and then check again in the afternoon.
I know. I have become a diva on Facebook of like, who has good turnip prices today? Let me come to your island.
So are you, this is not at all the topic of the podcast, but are you the representative of your island, or are your kids in charge?
I am not. My 9-year-old is.
Exactly the same in here.
So it's like I wasn't aware when we set up the game and I let her go first that I would now be relying on her to like snap all of the story into place. So it's like I sit there and I'm like, hey, I left 50,000 bells outside your house so you can move Cherry's house to where I have it in my grid system. And then I'll come back like 40 minutes later and she's like, I spent it all at the Able Sisters. I was like, that's not what that was for.
I swear you and my wife could have a really great conversation about this the same way.
I mean, there's a lot of screaming into a pillow at night over this, but...
My wife is holding up a sign across from me. She feels this deeply. Wanted to talk about Nothing Special, which hadn't debuted last time we chatted.
No,
but,
it was probably in the works.
I think so, yeah.
But not out yet.
So the 4th season is out, just came out, started a couple weeks ago, and it is so delightful.
That's the 3rd.
3rd season, okay.
Yeah.
It is so delightful. It is so wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
And my daughter, our official 4th grade correspondent here at The Other 51, is, as I mentioned before, she's cosplaying as Callie. She made her own Radish that's in her pocket right now. And she wanted to pop on and ask you a couple questions about it, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Hi.
Hi there.
Does Radish have a backstory?
Radish does have a backstory. Every once in a while, he hints at past lives of always being a radish. But one of the ones that we touch on in season 1 is that he came from an organic farm and he was scratched out of the ground by a chicken, which is why he hates chickens, and left to rot. And then another time he was a garnish on a vegetable tray and he felt very slighted because no one ever eats the radish garnish off the vegetable tray, and they tried to feed him to a dog and even the dog didn't want to eat him, so he rolled under a stove. So he has a plethora of stories about being a radish, which basically comes from the fact that I never eat them and I eat a lot of vegetables and I'm still like, let's just push that up. So we joke that he's a very bitter vegetable.
I actually call my dog my emotional support radish sometimes.
That's perfect.
How long does it take to write a chapter of Nothing Special?
Actually, I write the entire season before I start drawing.
Wow.
So I basically take about 3 or 4 months and I write the script and then I go through a lot of edits. And the current book is about as long as season 2 was, which takes an entire ream of paper to print. And then I go through and I decide where all my chapter breaks are. Like where a good spot to break in the story would be, where a great little breather would be. So basically I take about 3 months and then I have a couple friends that always read the Nothing Special scripts for me, that are professional comic book editors in their own lives. And they do me a solid and look at everything. But then it takes a week just to draw one chapter from pencils and inks. And then it goes on to another week of the colorist and the letterer. So each chapter takes 2 weeks to make.
That's crazy.
Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Good job. So for anyone listening who is wondering why we're talking about emotional support radishes and all of this, can you kind of give the background and if it's possible, kind of sum up nothing special in the world about it?
Yeah, and I mean, that's nutty because it's very expansive at this point. But I mean, it really does revolve around these 3 older teens, that are trying to find their place in the world and with each other. And the glue that binds them together is this dead vegetable that's a radish who is really obsessed with the main character, Callie. It's basically her pet at this point. And, he has different relationships with everybody in the story. But, season 1 is, the first foray into this magical world, which was really inspired by the Neil Gaiman book, Stardust, where it's like they go through the wall and all of a sudden there's a spirit world. I basically said, I'm going to just do that, but modern day, and make up my own adventure. For these kids in a magical land. So they have one foot in the modern realm and then another foot in where magic and fairies and dragons and stuff are real. And yeah, it's like I said, the first book is kind of them transitioning into this life. The second book is, total immersion into what this world really is, but it still draws parallels to our own modern society, because they're like, well, magic is basically money at this point, guys. There's, you figure out that there's snotty 1%ers everywhere and they're all fairies. And then book 3 is going to deal with even more of this world. Basically already, I just finished drawing chapter 13, and we're going to see 2 other worlds that exist within this world. So it's going to be really interesting.
So you mentioned the book that kind of inspired the idea, but where did this story come from for you, and how did you decide to start doing that this is something you were going to do?
For me, it's, Webtoon gave me, just this opportunity to do whatever I wanted. And I had already worked on My Little Pony. I'd been, doing illustration stuff for Star Wars, and I love fantasy stories. I love stuff that's a little epic. And it was the first time that somebody came to me that wasn't a license and said, whatever you want to do. And they were going to pay me to do it. And it was just this moment of like, oh, wait a minute. And I wrote a story for book 1 that was a book I wish existed when I was in middle school.
Okay.
Back when, graphic novels that were aimed towards young girls were not common back then. All we really had was manga, and not all of that was translated yet. It's like we had Fruits Basket and that's it. Archie comics. So I was like, you know what? I want to write about, this girl who actually is on the surface. She's already got all of these interesting kind of things about her. But she comes from a world where none of that really makes you special. It's like the fact that she's from a magical realm, but all she can do is talk to dead plants at that point. So it's like, ta-da, I have the world's worst superpower. And then you find out along the way that there's a lot more to it, and that, she and her friends are a lot more interesting and braver than they think. And there's a lot of growing that happens, which is really fun for me, because basically I took that most awkward age of your life, that 16, 17, 18, where you're just on this weird cusp of adulthood and people, are trusting you with different things, and then threw everyone into the deep end. It was like, here you go. Have no parental supervision.
With magic. Yes. With
magic. And it was fun. And it gave me a chance to write something with a strong female character. And, the boy that, has been in love with her forever. And I didn't want a love triangle. I hate love triangles. So I got to be like, haha. I threw in another guy and she automatically pulls a knife on him. It's like, so I killed every trope that's usually in a teen story immediately in the first book. Like I wrote them all in that everyone considers like the typical love interest and this and that. And then I completely like shot it down the second I introduced it as like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And then it was so funny. I was talking to another comic artist that I respect very much last year about Nothing Special. And he was telling me how much he was enjoying it. And then he went, oh, but it's so weird about Declan, who's the main boy. And he's like, oh, they just kind of drag him around and he's just there to be pretty and useless. And oh my God, he's the girl. Like you just saw this moment of recognition from this creator that's in their 50s of like, you wrote him as the girl. And I was like, yep.
Our fourth grade correspondent has another question for you. So.
Mm-hmm.
In season 2, who's really the bad guy? Declan's grandma or Lazarus' brother?
You know what? That is a loaded question because she's not a great person. Tansy hints that she used to be a lot better. And of course, Laurel has a lot of friends that, really respect her and really love her. And her family very obviously is very respectful and very fond of her. But Lierre is not a good person. So she is old lady, bad lady, like the one that the grandma that you have to see at a reunion and she's going to give you $20 for Christmas. So you still kiss her cheeks and say, hi grandma, love you grandma. Whereas Lierre is not good. He's done a lot of very bad things. And book 3, we're going to meet a lot more of Lazarus Family.
Ooh.
Which is, I made his dad very complicated to draw. I've been kicking myself for 6 weeks. There's little hints of him on Instagram right now, but he's fun to draw. But yeah, it's we get to see a lot of where Lazarus is from and really focus more on what he is now because, book 1 focused a lot on Callie, book 2 focused a lot on Declan, and book 3 focused a lot on Lazarus. But the twist in all of the writing in this is that whoever gets the character development that season is not the person that the book is focused on. It's the side person. Because, in book 1, Callie figures out more about herself, but Declan is the one that really learns something about the world and a new thing. And in book 2, Declan is the centerpiece, but Lazarus is the one that has all the character development. And actually with book 3, it centers on Lazarus and his family and a few other things. But Callie is the one that's going to learn how to be a better person out of all this because she's a flippant teenager right now. She's had a taste of omnipotence at this point. So you gotta shoot that down.
Go ahead.
How many times did you hide yourself and your family in the pictures there in season 2? Because I found like a lot of them.
Oh yeah, I put my kids in all the time because they are always in my office while I'm working. And, I just tend to stick them in wherever. And myself, I put myself in complaining all the time.
Yeah, it made me laugh so hard when you drew yourself at the ferry bar.
That was the time I was literally scrolling through and I just said, oh, hi, Katie, when I saw you. Yeah. I just kept going. So that brings me to something I wanted to ask you, which is about the backgrounds and how rich they are. And my wife and I were talking about this, and it's almost like the setting in the world and the backgrounds you draw, which are incredibly detailed and incredibly funny. It's almost like Pawnee or Springfield in that it's its own little world, its own character in the show. So how in the story, how did you kind of make that decision to develop that?
There's something that I don't love when it comes to the weekly comic is the lack of backgrounds in things, or the canned backgrounds, that are just like the 3D modeling and stuff, which I appreciate the effort that goes into it, but that kind of stuff really does not match my artwork at all. My artwork is cartoonish. It is squishy. It is like you could poke everything in the belly and it'll just giggle like the Pillsbury Doughboy. And, I want this lushness in what is really simple line art. And, it's really important to me that the background is kind of its own character. I want everything to match the scene and be really fun to look at. And there's a lot of little details like that in the comic. Callie's ponytail is its own character. It does whatever it wants, and sometimes it spells out words and things like that. Same with Uncle Matty's beard, with all the stuff that he crams into it. It's another level of enjoyment. One for me, because I get to have fun thinking of something weird to draw in the background. And then for the people that read the comic, there's, this world building that goes on that's so subtle, and that's something that I really like. And I think that it like almost immerses you in the world. And it, in the comments from the comic, I see a lot of people are like, oh, I always have to go back and read it twice to go appreciate the details. And, you don't get that from some comics that are like, well, I just don't do backgrounds, because they're just trying to meet the standard for, Webtoon. We have to put out 30 full color panels a week.
Okay.
And sometimes I do upwards of 60 to 70. So I don't sleep very much.
I was going to say, do you ever, as great as it is and as fun as it is, do you ever kick yourself for making that decision?
Oh, all the time. Today I actually made the executive decision, because every few weeks, usually about every 15 weeks, I throw in a Radish Q&A,
right,
which is something that I can draw in about 3 days as opposed to 7 days. And I've been hanging out with my daughter for most of the morning building a model, because I made the executive decision this morning, because I just finished a Star Wars book as well. On top of all this, I was like, I'm going to make this a Q&A week, a week earlier than my schedule. I am going to not kill myself trying to wrap up a chapter this week. I'm going to do a Q&A chapter. And I had to talk myself into it.
So, mentioning Star Wars is a good transition kind of back to something you said earlier. You've written a lot of Star Wars. You wrote My Little Pony. I think when last time we talked, you mentioned when you write for a license, they have a Bible, and it's very much how Pinkie Pie is going to respond to something. You don't move out of character. Yes, you drew Pinkie Pie. And now, so what's it like to go from writing from that to blank page, you're in control of the whole world?
It's almost at this point like I have my own licensing Bible for how my characters react, because I've been doing so many chapters with these guys that they all have to react in a very specific way, but I get to be the puppet master for that. I get to do the story, I get to do all this, and I really appreciated it. A few months ago, I wrote some stuff for the Avengers for IDW.
Okay. And
there was so many notes about how to treat these characters with respect, because I was not doing that. There was one note back, because I put on, there's a Marvel character that everyone knows is the worst supervillain ever, named Paste Pot Pete. He's now called Trapster, but I made him Paste Pot Pete, and I rewrote him because no one has touched this character in a long time. And I made him a 5th grade teacher at an elementary school, and he sees Captain America there for a hero day, and he decides to have one last hurrah and puts on his old costume from 50 years ago and tries to attack Captain America during a kindergarten safety day. And I turned in this script, and someone at Marvel was like, did we say she could do this? We're gonna need some rewrites here. And I was like, I don't know, throw Squirrel Girl in. Let's make it worse.
So it is not. So it's both the niceness and the challenge of being able to do that yourself. You can decide it, but now you don't have that. Did you ever, when you were first building it, obviously now you kind of know the world, but when you were drawing book 1, was it a bit, I don't know, what was it like to not have those guidelines and to kind of have that freedom yourself?
Well, it's because it was it's like a rudderless boat at that point, because you're like, oh, I don't know. Okay, I guess I could take it in this direction, or I could go here. I could what? It's especially with Callie, because it's a teenage girl. There's a lot of different directions you can take that kind of personality. And a lot of different ways you could take the characters. I mean, there are so many people that are obsessed with the idea of her dropping Declan. And I was like, no, that is not how that's going to work. That is my OTP. I was like, that's not character development.
So how did you kind of work through that then in that first book, that rudderless ship? How did you kind of set up or figure out what the characters are going to be?
Really, like I said, I wrote the whole script ahead of time. So I had it kind of nailed down, and I knew where I wanted everything to go. And it's very much set up like a traditional fairy tale, with the three challenges and the main foe at the end, and everybody kind of shows their true colors in those final chapters. Because spoiler alert, you meet Callie's mom, and it doesn't go really well. So I think it's the first point in the story where it's like, oh no, people die here. It's like, this is a horrible murder world as well. This is a fantasy realm. It's like, some people here really suck. Because in the first book, it was a kind of a soft transition into that world, because so much of it takes place in the forest between this very limited group of characters, which is why in book 2, I really wanted to just see basically everything. Even though it killed me to be like, all right, town, tavern, giant mansion. It's like, let's throw everything and show that this is a fairy tale realm. It's a big, crazy world.
Right.
So book 1 was like narrowing the scope, and book 2 was blowing the door wide open again.
Right. So I wanted to ask, one thing I did want to ask on Nothing Special was the kind of layout of Webtoon, because it's a scrolling comic. It's very different, I think, than the normal comic page panel setup. Now, how do you kind of handle that as a layout? Do you think of it as like a comic with panels and just stretched, or is that a completely different thing?
In the beginning, I think you can really tell in the first several chapters of the first book that I was really struggling with still trying to keep it like a comic book with the panel. And then at some point, kind of by act 2, I just started using it I would thumbnail in a scroll. Like, my notebooks are now no longer pages. It's like I thumbnail it out in that big long format. Mm-hmm. And then in book 2, I just went nuts with how nutty some of those really long panels get. And I love that. And I like using it as a storytelling device of seeing the stuff dripping down until you get to that next panel, and using that as your transition, into the art and the word balloon of the next panel. And I think it's a really neat narrative device. And I used it. I just did a big panel, that I sent off last week that's 70 inches long.
Oh my goodness.
That goes from like a bug's eye view from the bottom of the shop floor, seeing what's going on in there, and then transitions down through the floorboards, through the basement of the shop, through layers of dirt and stuff like that, and then turns into this dripping mess that leads into this really underground great hall. That is based on the grand foyer from the London Natural History Museum, if you've ever been there. With the big skulls everywhere and big crazy stairs, but it's 70 inches long. And it was like, but it leads directly into where I want this to be. And in the script, it's just open on hall. But when I thumbnailed it, it was like, well, it would be so much better because I want to go from this transition here to telling the story here. And I want a reminder that it's all part of this thing, but it's underground and it's this and that. And it was like, oh, man, so I really shot myself in the foot sometimes. But I'm having fun.
Right.
So
what's it like to see the reaction? I mean, obviously we're nerds talking about this, but the reaction, the fan reaction to it, to this comic that you created for Webtoon, and to see the fan art and how people have responded to that. What's that been like for you?
It is so touching and fun and wonderful, because I've seen cosplayers and people make me little radishes, and I get tagged in fan art. So many comments on Instagram and Twitter and whatnot. And it's, these are people responding to a thing that's me. Mm-hmm. And the project that I've done that's the most me, of all time. So to see any kind of scope, is just insane. And it actually got nominated for Best Webcomic at the Ringo Awards last year. It did not win, but it was still I was in the room, and, when they said my comic and my name, this huge cheer from all of my peers in comics went up. And, like people, like, yeah, Katie. It's like, oh my God. And it was just this moment of like, wow, that's insane. So, because I mean, like I said, I've worked in children's licensing comics for so long, and there's, I love it. But most of my fans are 6. So it's been really interesting writing this because it is all ages. So I have anything from, elementary school students. There's a few people in my daughter's class, my 9-year-old, that read it. And it's just this funny thing of like, your mom's Katie Cook. Like I did a career day there and got to kind of show off. Neat. And then, right up to all the teenagers and then adults that love it. And I love that it hits a lot of different age groups. And every time I get tagged in something, I get really excited.
So what advice do you have for, let's say, kids in elementary school or middle school who love comics, want to make comics, but maybe find themselves struggling with one part of it? So like they're really good at telling stories, but aren't great at drawing, not as good drawing yet. Or the other way around, like they're really good at drawing, but maybe are still learning how to write. What advice do you have for them?
I tell everybody that the best thing you can do if you want to make comics is to read every day and draw every day. I love books, even though right now I listen to a lot of audiobooks while I work, or I listen to a lot of story-based podcasts, because you actually become a better storyteller when you read a lot of books. It doesn't matter if it's like true crime or, any kind of book. You just learn different pacing and different things from books, and also different movies and things like that. My husband was a film major, so he's a big movie buff. So I've watched 10 million movies in the past many years being married to him. And, that's a big part of it, is learning how to tell stories from finding out what stories you like from other people, and then draw every day. You can tell there's such a huge difference in the art from book 1 to what it is now. And a lot of that was because for about 3 years, I was a writer. Cartooning is my love and my passion. And it's, I have a BFA in illustration, but all of a sudden I found myself in a position where every company wanted to hire me to write.
Okay.
So I was never like, oh, I have to go draw this thing now. Like I'd do a couple Star Wars books here and there, just the illustrations, but I wasn't drawing comics. So I was actually like, I sat down to draw nothing special and realized I hadn't spent a lot of time drawing for the past couple of years. Like I did commissions and I had fun and I drew my own things and I drew some fan art, but I didn't draw books. So like I said, you can really tell in those first several chapters that I wasn't drawing all the time. And then you can tell, like, look at the latest one and be like, Katie draws like for 12 hours a day every day now. It is real obvious.
And my wife actually wanted me to ask you this question too, because she likes to draw and she can eye draw. I think is that the term? Eye draw? Sight draw, sorry. She can sight draw, and she'll sight draw your characters kind of for practice, and she's really good at it. But she wanted to know, like, what advice you have to going from that into drawing your own characters, so that instead of just sight drawing and make it look like somebody, an original, make it not look like my wife's version of Katie Cook's characters.
You know what? It really just comes in time. I started when I was a little kid, pausing Disney movies and drawing what was on the screen.
Neat.
And that was like, I had sketchbooks full of, like Disney's Hercules and things like that were just like drawings from the screen. And that's practice. That's an amazing thing. And then eventually, after you draw all of these things from different artists that you like, your own style really starts to emerge over time. I see little bits and pieces of different artists that I admire in my own work all the time. I like to think that I've developed it into something that's all me, but there's still little things that the way that I draw the pupils and eyes, I completely stole from Dr. Seuss.
Okay.
I stole that from Dr. Seuss when I was 11 and I still do it. The way I draw noses for a little while was all Calvin and Hobbes, or that's the way I don't do the noses that way anymore, but the way that I do a fold in fabric, completely ripped off from Bill Watterson, even though it's not as detailed. So you're going to pick up little bits and pieces from all these people that you admire, and eventually something's going to click and you're just going to go off on your own tangent. And, it's just practicing. Like I said, it's just drawing every day. And one day you're going to, do a drawing based on someone else's work and then kind of look over to the blank piece of the paper and say, well, what if I add something over here?
Right. It's kind of like musicians. Like you kind of start off covering other musicians, or you learn to play the Beatles, or you learn to play the Ramones or whatever, and then you kind of learn that way. It sounds very similar.
Yeah, you learn to walk before you can run.
Right. So I ask everybody I have on the podcast this, so I'll ask you, what's the best thing you've read lately? Or audiobook listened to, since you're doing that a lot.
Let's see. Almost all of the new Nothing Special book was created while binge listening to the podcast Small Town Murders.
Okay.
Which is two comedians doing very, very terrible takes on hillbilly murders.
Oh, that's hysterical.
It is. They're very fun. But let's see. Book-wise, I just read one called The Feather Thief.
Okay.
That was about the largest robbery of a natural history museum that was outside of London, not the London one. And it's a guy that stole all of these taxidermied specimens of birds that he then pieced out because he was an artisanal fly fish tire.
I think I remember hearing about this. Yeah.
NPR covered this story a while back, and then this guy wrote an entire book about it. Like, he spent years digging up at where everything was. So yeah, it is the story of this this douchebag who was a professional flute player or clarinet player. Yeah. Who just kind of robbed a museum of hundreds of birds so he could do fly fishing ties, and then he would sell them to other fly fishermen, and then the fly fishing community helped him cover up the crime.
Right. I remember it was on. I think it was on This American Life. I'm remembering listening to it, and it's one of those things where suddenly an emotional support Radish doesn't sound so far fetched when you hear this real story.
So yeah, I just finished that one, and that I would look up from the book every once in a while and look at my husband and be like, and then I just grabbed one that's a really weird one about the history of the Natural History Museum in New York.
Oh, neat.
And how they got all their weird exhibits. Hey, spoiler alert, book 4 is going to have a lot to do with basically natural history museums. So this is actually kind of a research binge I've been on. They do run an antique shop.
They do. Yeah, absolutely. So, and a bookshop, and Lasser can start selling books if he needs to. I mean, there's a lot of crossover potential there. So the Nothing Special, it is on Webtoon. It comes out Monday nights, Tuesday mornings, kind of. I don't know. So, and
yeah, usually it used to be Tuesday, right at midnight. And then they bumped the schedule because I think they were like, Katie is too old to stay up till midnight to make sure her comic posts. So we got to do it before she goes to bed.
So Monday nights, I can't recommend this highly enough. It is so delightful, and it is a great antidote for, gestures at the world and everything going on. So, Katie can draw on all the social medias. Excellent.
All the social media.
Excellent. Well, Katie, this has been wonderful. Thanks again for answering questions. Thank you to our 4th grade correspondent. And, my daughter also wanted me to showcase that she's continuing to draw you as Katie Cookie, and very proud of it.
I love it. That's the name. That's what my dad calls me.
Oh, awesome. So, Katie, this is great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.